Hello, we are going to talk about the Restoration period in English literature. Restoration period gained visibility from the second half of the 17th century to the last decades of the 18th century. It may seem far back in the past and considered foreign to us today. The truth is, however, that the Restoration period gave new wings to the literary writers and critics, defined fashion and urbanization, instigated waves of modern political philosophy, introduced a consumerist culture along with commercial prosperity. It also gave rise to global trade and marked an important period for dramatic modernization. Politically, the Puritan experiment in the government did not survive Cromwell's death in 1658 for long, and less than 2 years later, in May 1660, Charles II, who was the exiled Stuart king, returned from exile accompanied by popular acclamation and was restored to the English throne. Initially, this period was dominated by Oliver Cromwell, but it is referred to as New Age because it was totally opposite of the rule of Cromwell, who shut down theatres and anything that was considered immoral. Charles II's reign was marked by the development of culture and arts as well as progressive ideas, landmarks in history, science and poetry which has supported Charles with such institutions as the Royal Society. Now you would think, what is literary trends all about? Literary trends start with the rise of Neo-Classicism. In the literature of Restoration era, society broke away from the restraints of Puritanism. The break with the past was almost absolute. England saw a willful suppression of the immediate past and glorified the more distant classical Roman past. Thus, it is sometimes called the Neo-Classicism period as well. Post-Restoration literature is a converse of the previous Elizabethan age. It determined a conscious self-awareness and put effort to understand everything in an interdisciplinary context. Now we will deal with the imitations of the ancient. With the notable revival of the common law, many English writers were influenced by old Latin classics and consciously reproduced them in their works. Lacking the genius of the Elizabethans, the authors of the time turned to the great classical writers, in particular to the Latin writers, for guidance and inspiration. This imitation of Latin works in writing was part of the neoclassical scholar, and it led to a great movement. Dryden was significant in formal criticism of English literature as well as translations of classics, especially those of Virgil. Many more translations of ancient classics were done during this age. The Latin classics were influenced because the works signified universality and permanence in the human experience. To know Latin was to be an educated scholar, and in fact, many knew Latin work better than works of English. As we have seen above, as I told you earlier, that there was a lot of influence of Latin literature. Not only that, there was also a lot of French influence. The common law brought back the old language of French, and the presence was first noticed with the publication of Henry Rolle's work. There was a great influence of French literature on the drama of Restoration period. Charles II and the literary enthusiasts had spent much of their time in France, and when they returned to England, they brought with them a new admiration for French literature. They willfully renounced the old ideals and standards and demanded that English poetry and drama follow the style to which they had grown accustomed to in the gaieties of Paris life. Such a decision instigated the possibility of the comedy of manners in Restoration era. The court of Charles II resembled Versailles in its aura and liveliness. in its heroic plays, the English stage had begun to breathe the sentiment, valor, and beauty of the language that defined the French drama, yet consistently concerned itself with the comedy. The work of great French dramatists had direct influence on English tragedy, particularly Pierre Corneille. Many English playwrights imitated the works of Molière, the French dramatist who was considered the master and genius behind the most brilliant comedy of those times. Not only this, realism and formalism also came into being. The Restoration literature developed realism in a marked degree. This tendency was at first not accepted, but later the tendency to realism became more wholesome. While it neglected much that is romantic and interesting to youth, it led to a keener study of the practical motives which govern human actions. Now, this was also an age of prose and reason. The Restoration period saw a juxtaposition of reason and religion, which brought to light the potential of science to explain the wonders of divine creation. The Royal Society contributed to such an explanation. This was the first great age of scientific instrumentation, which successfully embarked on the journey to explain the marvels of the universe. Some of the great philosophers such as Boyle, Pascal, Lamartine, Montesquieu, Cordial, Voltaire, Rousseau, D'Alembert, de Holbach, Godwin, Wollstonecraft, Lessing, Kant, Stahl, Fichte, Gauss, Malthus, Smith, and Hegel came alive in this period. This tendency towards formalism and preciousness, this avoidance of enthusiasm or the exaltation of reason over passion would justify us in calling this period an age of prose and reason. In Dryden's age, English prose begins definitely to find its feet, and a prose style is gradually evolved, which is admirably suited to the miscellaneous needs of everyday life. The critical temper of the age, the growth of science, and religious and political controversies all fostered the rise of prose. It attempted to explain how the word works and breaks down all the essential elements of scientific inquiry, religious intervention, and criticism to understand the universe. Now, because of the introduction of reason here, there was a decline of lyric and rise of a satire. During this period, lyric spirit is largely on the decline, and outside Dryden, there was very little lyrical poetry of any worth. The bulk of the poetic is narrative, argumentative, and its purpose was being to convince or persuade, not to inspire. The best poetry of the era is satirical. Example, Dryden wrote a political satire called Absalom and Ahithophel, and John Oldham, a poet Dryden highly admired, wrote satires upon the Jesuits. Another important development that occurred during the Restoration period was the emergence of the novel, which brought forth new possibilities of the satire. With writings from Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, there rose an emphasis on satire and away from the intricate rhetorical style of earlier writers like John Milton and John Donne. The Restoration comedy of manners also satirized the elite's social behavior with witty dialogues. Now we are going to deal about how the perfection of the heroic couplet took place. Now, the heroic couplet means 2 lines of rhymed iambic pentameter, which was an important verse form during this period. Its popularity and acceptance came forth with the tendency of this form to combine elegance and wit. This age significantly contributed to the growth and perfection of the heroic couplet. though Chaucer had also used this couplet, but he cared more for the thought than for the form. But with the Restoration writers, form became all important. So, Restoration marks the strongest assertion in post-medieval times of what we might call the Mediterranean component in British culture. The most obvious unknown influences mediated through the returned cavaliers and their king. They were French, but they came from France, whose first minister, premier musician, and favorite company of farceurs were all Italian-born and whose culture was vigorously reaffirming its own Mediterranean heritage against the Nordic infections of schism, democracy, and counterpoint. There is a relation between literature and the social representation of this era. Basically, in mentioning the clothing style, you can see the gender discrimination and social norm of the time. Clothing in the Restoration expressed the suppressed feelings of freedom during the Puritan period. The unsuitable behavior of countries had been subdued for 11 years, and the Restoration is the period when everything that had been quiet is cut loose. Gentlemen wore wigs that had curls all over them and shaved their heads. The faces were shaved at first and then only a thread of moustache. The hat moved to a higher crown, stiffer and little narrow-brimmed hat, and it was cocked to one side. All men tried to wear a cravat around the neck rather than the huge collars. Women wore ringlets clustered in the back of their hair with smaller tendrils waved around the face, which replaced the earlier dense frizzle. Rich women would weave pearls into their hair and put nosegays in their buns. The ever common people wore simpler hair. When it came to how the society conducted itself, the word sentiment signified social behavior in accordance to instinctual feeling. Sentiment and the related notions of sensibility and sympathy all fostered an increasing sense of public philanthropy and social reforms, such as charities for orphans. The individual life became significantly important, and much of the emphasis was placed on the notions of privacy and liberty. Politeness was acquired as a code for social interactions, a behavioral standard for which everybody aspired. After a gap of 18 years since the English Civil War in 1642, theatre had come alive again in England during the Restoration period. Charles too was the key figure in making this a reality, and the swift establishment of a space for drama and its acceptance as a social respectable amenity was only possible in view of the king's vested interest in the field of theatre. The word drama was used casually, unreflectively during the Restoration period. Set in London, the word is synonymous with the comedies which were written by men who focused almost wholly on amusement for the corrupt court and pleasure seekers. To good royalists, no less than to rakes, it was a way of carrying on the war against the Puritans, to hold up and to ridicule the moral code which they had imposed on the country, and in which most men refused to see anything else but lies and hypocrisy. Thus, there was extreme licentiousness in dramatic works of that time. It was not because the time was coarser than those of Monston, Middleton, and Massinger, but because there reigned a fundamental cynicism which regarded the virtues as a suspect of ridicule and associated the vices with the qualities of open-heatedness and plain speaking. As a whole, it is said that the Restoration theatre continued the tradition held by Renaissance and the progress of time introduced external and internal changes that contributed to its uniqueness. The scenery, which had always been poor on the popular stage and formerly only displayed its splendor and illusion in the space of operas and the court masque, now played an important part and became the decisive factor of success. More than the above, the Restoration drama was in conjunction with the other areas of cultural history. Steward of the Restoration was a restoration for drama. The theatre had been made illegal by the Parliament in 1642. Upon his arrival in England from France, Charles II restored drama to the English stage. He allowed two theatres in England, the King's and the Duke's. As a part of innovation rather than restoration, women were allowed to act for the first time. Earlier, men would play the female characters, but the king's wish was to see the play with actresses as he was accustomed to during exile. At last, the conclusion indicates that the Restoration drama was a class drama to degree that no earlier stylization of a deliberately cultivated upper-class ethos. Although open to public, theatres were adjuncts of the court. Now, tragedy was symbolic of excellence in dramatic literature. It was epitome of language and performance. All other forms of drama were considered inferior in finesse and style. The Royal Society ensured the usage of clear and succinct English, which later affected the response of Shakespeare's plays. Restoration tragedy began with Dryden in 1631 and it went on till 1700. He was an influential English poet, literary critic, translator, and playwright who dominated the literary rife of Restoration era. England to such a point that the period came to be known in literary circles as the Age of Dryden. Walter Scott called him Glorious John. He was made Poet Laureate in 1668. Dryden's verbal brilliance remains a unique strength, but his command of the theatrical medium is less certain. His preoccupation with literary issues can sometimes be a source of weakness rather than strength. Nonetheless, Dryden was significant in introducing heroic tragedies full of blood and thunder to amuse the audience. Restoration tragedy is a misnomer. When tragedy means an exploration of human life, a following of obscure currents of consciousness wherever they may lead, no restoration play may claim the status of tragedy. Instead of a formulation of problems, a demonstration of dilemmas, rather in the manner of the problem play, or better still, of the medieval morality. These types of dramas must stand or fall by its handling of situation, for it is manipulating the characters through a series of revealing situations that the dramatist expresses his meaning in. This is the technique of melodrama, and indeed the term restoration melodrama is to be preferred to the traditional and misleading label. Restoration tragedy, like all melodrama, also has some serious drama which is given to the violent overstatement and find its power in theatre rather than on printed pages. In Dryden's play All for Love, which was written in 1677, which was performed at the Theatre of Royal in Drury Lane, we see a departure from heroine drama to tragic serious play. Rhyme is forsaken for blank verse, and the dramatic unities of time, place, and action are adhered to much more closely. The play seemed to have enjoyed a special place in Dryden's own affectation towards the end of his life, and he recalled that I never write anything for myself but Anthony and Cleopatra. His own critical writing said that the aim is finally illustrative and pictorial. To paint the passions was the words with which he described his way of writing dramas. Later in serious drama, the plays called heroic replaced the tragedy, and Dryden was famous in this genre. Heroic plays were not the result of classical influence. They preserved their composition, the usual freedom and overloading of the national theatre. They took their rules from neither Latins visible, even and nor from the Greeks. They owed much to France, but more in content than in form. The influence of France was even visible during the staging of the plays. Charles too was interested to see the play against scenery and ended up developing the scenic stage for much of English public theatre. He sent Davenant's actor-manager to research France only to observe the various styles and designs of the splendid scenery in French plays. Such research ended up creating a concept of painted sliding shutters amid spectacular surroundings in English theatre. This also pointed to the possibility that dramatists now could amuse the audience by unexpected discovery in the plays. Now, the comedy that encompassed chaste love and honor romances, sexual intrigues, depicting disguises and wit, and political religious satires came in a wide variety of often very diverse in form, style, content and tone. No one style was perceived as the quintessence of Restoration comedy. The serious plays of the Restoration were as far removed from reality as possible. They represent the factitious ideal of heroism, which policed an entirely unheroic age, and the interplay of noble passions as imagined by the generation more skeptical than passionate. It was not only the mirror of the society, but also of the reflection of the gay intrigues and an echo of the cynical and frivolous conversations, which are reality of dissolute worldlings. There has been much discussion of the question whether this comedy was artificial or realistic. Sometimes it is the shadow of both. Artificial, in that it made great use of traditional theatrical methods, caricature, the exaggeration, near to farce, and the exclusion of aspects of character which did not accord with its design. It is realistic because it overflows at the same time with lively sketches taken straight from contemporary life, and with the sort of libertinism philosophy which was largely related to society. Comedy had broken with the Romanticism in which it was steeped in Shakespearean time. It had broken with the verse tradition and showed its realistic tendency by the regular use of prose. There is an example of Restoration comedy which was written by Sir George Etheredge in 1635, The Country Wife, and it was also edited in 1675. Etheredge made some French and classical approaches. It is a brilliant, although on the surface of its paradoxical juxtaposition. On the one hand, the libertine who is so ruthless in pursuit of the single goal that all other considerations of the reputation and convenience are as nothing, and on the other hand, the former libertine who embarks on marriage in the full knowledge of all to which he thereby renders himself vulnerable. As these two strands of plot intertwine, the play is driven towards and forward by contradictory human yearnings, the commanding desire for the sensual gratification and the uncertain hope for happiness beyond the above sensuality. When Sparkish mockingly referred to honor as the sign of a man, the term is alive with significance which Sparkish does not suspect. Honor is a man rather diminished rather than confirmed by gratification, and what was conceived as a stratagem to ensure freedom becomes a kind of treadmill. At the same time, the revelation comes to life in the essentially confident character. The character of Marjorie, that in the country are to be found no values which might be set in opposition to those of the city. This keeps the dramatization of civilization and its discontents from lapsing into sentimentality. Dryden's comic subplots like The Wild Gallant, which was written in 1667, Lacy's depiction of women wearing men's clothes and displaying their legs for disguise, in The Old Troop in 1672, and in Etheridge's Wit in Conversation illustrating political society in The Man of Maud, which was written in 1676, are examples of the assorted styles and the relationship between the plays, common themes and chronological development. But an apparent observation is that the sense of humor at the time had element of satire, deliberate abuse and coarse drama which were clearly seen in the works of Dryden. Marvell and Rochester were other writers who also seemed to have the same effect of drama of Dryden. So the writings seek from verbal abuse to practical jokes and tricks, initializing a movement that shows comedy in an entirely different light. Now, this was all about the Restoration period in the time of literature. Thank you so much.